everybody. Welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show for another roundtable here. We've got Dr. Jim with us, as usual, and a returning guest, Dr. Tomas Bogardus, who we had just a fascinating conversation with recently on gender, and we're going to explore some of his other work. He's a great generalist, as we like on this show. So I'm excited to see where this conversation goes, because I think we all have a lot in common. But Thomas, you and Jim actually have even more in common, because you're both published in issues related to philosophy of mind, and you both like to put people into rear naked chokes and arm bars as well. So if we could somehow blend all that together in today's conversation, I'll consider it a success.
So it's exciting to learn about Jim, because I like to keep tabs on other philosophers who are into grappling. I guess I don't know exactly how many I know of now, but maybe 7 or so.
Oh, cool. Excellent. How long have you been training, Thomas?
Well, I guess I started in 2015, so coming up on 6 years now. I did a little bit of wrestling in high school, and then when I was at the University of Texas, they had a wrestling club. They don't have a wrestling team, so I hung out with them for a couple of years. But what I was really looking for was jiu-jitsu. I just didn't know it. I wanted to grapple, so I thought, oh, that means wrestling. But it turns out it's kind of hard to find like wrestling for grown-ups.
Yeah, right. It's a young game, man.
Yeah. So I was doing my best, but then, it wasn't until later. It was actually the jiu-jitsu gym opened up like on my commute. So every day I'd be like rubbernecking. And then one day I decided to just go in there, and I had all the bad habits that wrestlers have. I kept getting guillotined, and so I've become very comfortable in getting guillotined. Out of necessity. But it was one of the best decisions I ever made going in that gym. I'm really happy I started training, and I recommend it to everybody.
Excellent. And what's your belt now?
I'm a purple belt, although I very rarely train in the gi. So I guess more of a purple rash guard.
Sure. Excellent.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. So I think what we want to focus on in today's episode is epistemology. And we haven't really done an extended episode on epistemology yet. So I'm trying to think of where the best place for us would be to start. And maybe that would be at the beginning. It's usually the best place to start, right? So Thomas, if you wouldn't mind, you have a recent article out. Is it even published yet? Or...
Well, it's been published online. I don't think it's been assigned to an issue in the journal, but it's definitely accessible.
Okay, so we will link that in the show notes so people have it. And I'm fascinated to see where this conversation goes. So help us set us up. What are you doing in this article, and why do you think it's important?
All right. Well, I think it was actually epistemology that got me interested in philosophy. I was studying biology as an undergrad, but then I remember I took a cognitive science class, and we were reading this Paul Churchland book, and he was giving these arguments against dualism, and one of them like targeted religious belief, because he thought, a lot of you are dualists because you're religious, so let me go ahead and try to undermine your religious beliefs. And it was one of those like elsewhere, else when kind of objections, like if you had been born at a different time in a different place, you would have had different religious beliefs. And so he said something like, this shows what we all suspected anyway, that religious beliefs are a result of social factors rather than like arguments and evidence or something like that.
Right.
And since I was religious when I was reading that, I took that personally.
Hey, man, that's brood.
Yeah. But that was the first time I'd ever really encountered like a serious philosophical challenge on my beliefs. And it was like, I think purely epistemological. And I think that might be why there's quite a lot of Christian philosophers in epistemology. And I think that's because like coming up through the ranks, we get told that we're irrational all the time. And so we kind of have to think about that. Like, am I being irrational? Do I really know that God exists, and so on? So I think that might be why a disproportionate number of Christian philosophers end up in epistemology. Anyway, that argument kind of stuck with me, and many years later, like actually, I kept with the philosophy of mind, and I wrote a dissertation in philosophy of mind. But even by the time I was like writing the dissertation, I was veering into epistemology, and eventually I wrote a paper on that sort of Paul Churchland elsewhere, else when argument, where I was trying to think of how the argument's supposed to go. Like what does it really prove if I accept that, you know, I could have been born in a different time in a different place, and I would have probably had different religious beliefs. Right. Does that really give me grounds to be skeptical of my religious beliefs? And I thought it was that sort of argument is relying on what you might call sort of modal conditions on knowledge, conditions that say, in order to know that one of your beliefs is true, you've got to believe it in the right sort of counterfactual situations. And so maybe what Paul Churchland was trying to get at was, you're forming your belief in such a way that it easily could have been false. So he thinks, it seems like he thinks that people like me were just relying on our parents, taking our parents' word for it, and just sort of absorbing our religious beliefs from the environment. And so the thought seems to be like, if the environment had been a little bit different, then your beliefs would have been different. Right. In a way that doesn't necessarily track the truth. I mean, from your current perspective, looking at those other situations, you would now judge that you would have ended up believing falsely. So if you happened to get it right, that's just by luck. That's just chance, and that doesn't really count as knowledge. And the other alternative is you didn't get it right at all, and then that's not knowledge either. So yeah, at that time when I wrote that paper, I thought probably this argument is operating via some sort of modal constraints on knowledge. But then the more I thought about it, and then I'll just say this last thing, and I'll stop talking about it. I'll let you guys say something. But the more I thought about it, I guess it was pointed out to me by other philosophers, and I sort of started noticing this myself, that this sort of debunking argument is actually really common across, I don't want to say every field of philosophy, but I bet every field of philosophy. And it's a debunking strategy that goes like this. Well, you only believe that because, and then what's cited is some sort of process that we think is suspicious in some way. And so, like, well, I noticed this in ethics when I started working on evolutionary debunking arguments. People say things like, well, you just hold your moral beliefs because they're reproductively advantageous, or they contributed to fitness in our ancestral environments, or something like that. Yes, yes. But you also get these sort of debunking arguments in metaphysics, like, well, you only believe in ordinary-sized objects because you get it in aesthetics, you get it in mathematics, when people argue for sort of fictionalism about mathematical objects. And so I thought that was interesting, and so I thought maybe there's something to this shared structure across all these areas of philosophy. What do these debunking arguments have in common? And it seemed like what they had in common was they were just pointing out that what they were alleging was the truth of your belief doesn't really figure into the explanation of your belief. Here, I'm going to tell you the explanation of your belief, and notice that it's not going to cite the truth of your belief. Right. So, I mean, let's just take a simple example. Well, the religious example is pretty easy. Well, yeah. What Churchland was saying was, you only hold these religious beliefs because your parents told you, or something like that. And notice I didn't have to say that your parents knew what they were talking about. You just believed what they told you. Yeah. Even if they hadn't known what they were talking about, you still would have believed them. And so I think what's being pointed out is we're getting this sort of rival explanation for where your belief came from. And the explanation doesn't require that your belief be true. And so that's supposed to be disturbing to us. Yes. And what that suggests is, and this is the final thing, what that suggests is knowledge requires that you believe something because it's true. Mm-hmm. The truth of your belief needs to figure into the explanation for why you hold it. And maybe that's why these debunking arguments have the structure that they do have. And so, yeah, then I thought maybe that's just what knowledge is. And so, there's your epistemological framework. I really like that we're, if I can chime in here just for a second, then we'll get Jim's thoughts. I actually like that we're framing this around these debunking arguments, because they've actually become really popular. I mean, especially among like the new atheists, this is one of their favorite sort of criticisms to push is, well,
you're only Christian because you grew up in, I don't know, some town in Ohio, right? And if you were to have grown up in Portland, Oregon, you'd have been an atheist or something like that. Or if you were in the Middle East, you'd be Muslim or something like that. Now, I guess the kind of like typical response there is, okay, even if that's true, it doesn't mean my belief is false. It just means we need to sort of investigate that belief independently of its origin, of how I came to hold it, if we think that this method was unreliable. So I guess, one thing to get clear on is how much damage these types of debunking arguments are supposed to do. One is just sort of maybe attempt to undermine your justification, to say like maybe you're just not warranted. The other is to try and say that the belief is actually false. And I think in that latter instance, it's going too far, right? Because we can think of like maybe the only reason that I think that the Earth goes around the sun, the only reason is because mom and dad told me, right? And they've told me a lot of things, right? And that might be the only reason. Like, but does that mean I'm wrong? I don't know, right?
Yeah. So if you search for this argument on YouTube, you'll find a statement of it from Richard Dawkins, and then there's also a video of William Lane Craig responding to the Dawkins version. And this is the sort of response that Craig gives. He actually says like, this is just a textbook version of the genetic fallacy. You can't show that belief is false just by pointing out that it has some sort of suspicious origins. And I mean, that's certainly true that the genetic fallacy is a fallacy, but I really don't think that that's what these skeptics are up to. I don't think they're trying to show that your belief is false. Right. They're just trying to show, as you said, that it's unjustified, unwarranted, or whatever word you want to choose, not knowledge.
Yes.
Otherwise motivated.
Right. Yeah. And I think and I'm glad we brought that up, because I think it's important to identify what exactly the objection is supposed to do, right?
I have to take this call real quick here.
Yeah, take your time, Jim. Yeah, we'll keep rocking and rolling. In fact, bring him in the podcast if you want. We have our first call. Okay, so good. Yeah, I just wanted to just make that distinction, to actually be as fair as possible to this type of objection, right? To say, okay, even if it doesn't go this far, it still presents us with something that I think is really worthy of consideration, and something that we should try to do work on, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think if this were like an ordinary sort of conversation with a friend or something, and the friend brings this up, I think it would be worth pointing out that, like, hey, if you were trying to show that religious beliefs are false, here's this thing called the genetic fallacy, and I hope we can all agree that you could end up with a true belief even using a bad method.
Yes.
But I think that the religious person who's involved in this conversation should be thinking one step ahead and saying, like, that's not where the conversation ends, because the more formidable version of this argument is targeting warrant, justification, knowledge, something like that. And I just wanted to say one other thing. Your viewers might encounter this argument with a sort of cognitive science flavor, because something else that religious skeptics like to bring up is there seems to be some evidence from cognitive science that we've got sort of hardwired dispositions to be religious. There's pretty compelling empirical evidence that children like reasoning teleologically.
Yeah.
So if you ask kids, why is this rock here or something, they'll say, so that I can step on it. Or why do birds sing? I think that's another one that they ask kids. And the kids will say things like, because it's beautiful, or something like that. And they'll point to like the purpose or the goal. So it looks like you don't have to teach humans to reason in that way. Humans like reasoning in a teleological way. Mm-hmm. And then also it's said that we've got this like hyperactive agency detector that was adaptive in ancestral environments. Because, you know, if you're like walking through the forest and you hear a sound, it's better to think that somebody's there and be wrong than brush it off and say, probably nobody's there. And so we've got this hyperactive tendency to project agency out into the world, to say like, maybe that's a person, maybe that's a person. And then the thought is like, when volcanoes erupt, we think, maybe that's a person.
You're right.
A super person, I better worship that super person or something. That's sort of a crude statement of it, but that's the idea. And then the thought is, that's why you hold these religious beliefs, because of these hardwired dispositions you have, not because the beliefs are true. Even if they were false, you still would have held them, or something like that.
Right. Good. Good, Jim. Anything you want to add so far? Yeah.
Yeah, a number of things. So I think a lot of what you're doing here is just like more evidence that, you know, the last 150 years of philosophy are a footnote on Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, right? I mean, so we're like that's your, I mean, not the first, but I think the most prominent, like, comprehensive debunking strategy. And people miss this, not just of religion, not just of ethics, but of science too, right? I mean, and Nietzsche realized very well that as soon as you turn things to telling just so stories, there's no end to the telling of just so stories, right? So if I can tell you a just so story of, well, you're only religious because, and then fill in a causal story, right? Well, then there's going to be causal stories available as to why I accept scientific truths too, right? I mean, you know, I think, yeah, you're right. There's very good evidence that we are evolved in some sense for certain kinds of belief, right? Including maybe religious belief, but we're also evolved in some sense to, you know, expect regularities from the past to hold into the future, right? Now, does that debunk that tendency to expect regularities from the past to hold into the future, which is the cornerstone of scientific causal explanation? Well, no, not necessarily, because there might actually be regularities, right, there to see, right? We're evolved, you know, to sort of track moving objects, right? Why? Well, because there are moving objects to track, right? And I think, you know, you can give an evolutionary causal story as to why we have religious beliefs, ethical beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. The one explanation of that, you know, might actually be because there are such entities to understand, right? Do you see my point, right? You see this a lot. This is another example I'm sure you're familiar with, Thomas, is, you know, people will point out how we clearly are hardwired to see faces, right? Children don't really have to learn to see faces, okay? And of course, sometimes the detection goes wrong and we'll recognize something as a face that isn't actually a face, right? But notice, I don't see a face in a blank white page. I see a face in a blank white page that suggests, you know, wrongly that there's been a face put there. Do you see that, right? So the detection can go wrong, but it doesn't go wrong just willy-nilly. It goes wrong when there's something kind of face-like to see there, okay? So it's not as if we're just making up vision of faces everywhere, right? We just have a very sensitive face detector. Do you see my point, right? And so I get what I'm getting at is are hardwired tendencies prone to error? Yes, but they're not prone to error that isn't grounded somehow in the way the world's showing itself, right? So the fact that they're prone to error doesn't show that they're not sensitive to things that are actually there, right? And using something like agency detection to say, well, we're hardwired with it, it's prone to some errors, et cetera, sure. But to say that all sort of non-physical or spiritual agencies that we might detect are thereby, you know, one of its errors begs some pretty big questions, right, about our background metaphysics. Right?
Yeah. So let me make sure I understand. I think that there's two ways one could respond to these sort of skeptical arguments, and I think, Jim, the way I'm understanding you is you're sort of describing one of these ways. So when somebody presents you with this kind of cognitive science debunking argument and says, hey, you've got these mechanisms in your brain that are telling you that there's all this agency out there in the world, one way you could respond is, well, maybe that little mechanism I have is useful and truth tracking, and although makes the occasional mistake, was implanted in me to lead me to the truth. And so, I mean, Alvin Plantinga in his work kind of says, maybe that's what's going on. If you're a theist, you should probably believe that. You should think that God gave us some sort of supernaturally endowed sense of the divine. And so when we get these sort of beliefs about God, as we look out into the starry sky at night, it's not the sort of belief that I hold with no connection to the truth. I do believe it because it's true. I believe it because God gave me this little mechanism to deliver beliefs about him, and he gave me that mechanism because he wants me to have true beliefs and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's one response you can give, and I think that's right. I mean,
so just quickly, Thomas, is your account, do you think, compatible with like a proper functionalism of Planiga, of a Plantingian variety?
Well, is it compatible? You say? Could they both be true? No, I guess no, because I think that proper functionalism is necessarily false.
Okay, there we go. Right.
Just because I think like all philosophical theses, like if true, it's necessarily true, and unfortunately, I think it's false. So no, I guess it's not compatible. But I kind of like it, and I think that there are some important insights, and I really enjoy reading Plantinga. I've gotten a lot out of it, but no, strictly speaking, not compatible.
Okay, we can bracket that one off for later, though. I was just curious for my own sake.
Not compatible because nothing's compatible with a contradiction, I guess, right?
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Can I make one point about the first leg? Yeah, I don't think you actually have to go with Plantinga and say, therefore this supernatural detector has been implanted in us by God, right? If indeed, if indeed there are such entities in our environment, it would make perfectly good sense that we would evolve capacities for detecting and dealing with them. In the same way, I don't have to have an implantation story about my ability to, track moving objects, because there are indeed moving objects in my environment, right? That are, that are there that we would expect the organism to evolve alongside, right? And so, we kind of want to say, yeah, we know that there's not like a fairy goblin detector hardwired in us, because we know there aren't fairies and goblins. Okay, do you see that? And that's why I think, though, anytime you say, then the debunking story makes sense, because we're operating from the presumption that the fairy goblin business is all false anyway. Okay. And this is kind of the point I'm making is these sorts of undercutting, quasi-evolutionary stories aimed at undermining certain types of belief presume as false, right, the beliefs in question up front.
Yeah. Well, hold on a second. Now I feel like I need to speak up on behalf of the religious skeptic, which I'm not really on their side, but I think the argument might be a little more subtle than that. So I think the idea is you've got this hyperactive agency detector, and it's true that you have this mechanism because there are agents around, and you need to know about them, if only human agents, but you also want to know about the animals and so on. But the problem is that it's hyperactive, and so you start projecting agency on volcanoes and lightning and so on, and you start forming these beliefs about like super agents.
But like this claim of hyperactivity, I think already begs the question. Because we don't believe in Zeus, right? Because we don't believe in, Poseidon, right? Now, I'm not coming out for Zeus and Poseidon, right? But note the substantive stance of the truth of these beliefs are what lets us decide our cases of versus not cases of hyperactivity.
Well, sometimes we do know that this hyperactive agency detector was a little hyperactive. Like, you hear a stick break and you think maybe that's a person, and you find out there's no person there. And then I guess what we've also discovered is like there's no God in the volcano causing it to erupt. There's no God throwing these lightning bolts around who lives on the top of that mountain over there. Haven't we discovered that, Jim?
Yeah, no, but my point is, it's because we've discovered that.
Yeah.
Right? Because we know that that's false.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think you have to bring in, it's like but.
So that's why we say it's hyperactive.
Yeah.
And the other thought is
stick cracking that I think, I think, oh, that's a person. That's not hyperactivity. That's just error.
Yeah, well, I think that's what they mean by hyperactive, like overly active, giving false positives. That's what they mean.
Yeah. That's true of all of our epistemic equipment, right?
All of our epistemic equipment is fallible, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm a little more confident about intuition, but hey, let's bracket that off for a second. All of our empirical senses, yeah, we occasionally get error.
Yeah,
if I found out that one of my beliefs is being formed by some piece of equipment I have that gives error in these sorts of conditions, then I would be concerned. And that's what the religious skeptic is telling me. They're saying, hey, this super agent you believe in, that's exactly the sort of situation where your agency detector is hyperactive and tends to give false positives. And so putting this in the language of explanationism, what they're saying is, you believe that there's this super agent because it seems to you that way, but it seems to you that way not because it really is that way, but rather because you've got this hyperactive agency detector. Yeah. So
right. Yeah.
But see, once again, this is kind of my question begging charge to them is I agree. Sometimes, you know, the agency detection gives me false positives, right? And at one time we ascribed agency, you know, behind like volcano eruptions, right? And I also want to look at like a disanalogy there too, because it's like, well, lots of like one, we could ask ourselves whether or not mythological people really thought of those as quasi-scientific explanations. I actually doubt that. Okay, but that's another. Okay, right? And moreover, even if they did, that's a case of sort of, you know, not just in a moment agency detection. I think someone's talking to me that would have been, you know, what's the best explanation for a volcano erupting, right? Well, you see, I think those are very different kinds of cases, right? But even leaving all that aside, it's like when you say, okay, we know that our agency detection goes wrong sometimes, right? And it went wrong supposedly, you know, when ancient people, you know, said Zeus was throwing lightning bolts. Okay, that was a false case. Ergo, this other one you're doing about, say, a first cause or something like that is subject to the same problem. Well, there's a lot of directions our agency detection goes in, and it seems like the skeptic is not claiming they're all undermined now, right? And I think they're like, why are we singling out certain of them, right, to be undermined by this, and not all of them, right? And once again, the whole thing, you know, is operating on things that we know now to be false, right? Right. I don't think we know the first cause to be false, right? You see my point? And I think to get the argument off the ground, you only get the just so story for beliefs you think are already inherently suspect.
Yeah. So maybe I can try and strike a middle ground or just pose a question here that might be useful, right? So in terms of the lightning strike, I don't know how we're defining Zeus, but yes, presumably it's not a physical being up there that's hurling down these bolts of lightning, right? However, I think that I think what the theist would want to say is, okay, maybe whatever our device was for detecting agency was off specifically, but it wasn't off generally, right? Because I mean, presumably there is agency still behind that. We just kind of got the specifics of that wrong, right? And same thing with like planetary motions. Like we were specifically wrong, you know, for a long time, but like we weren't like generally, like things are moving, right? Like they really are moving, and we had to kind of refine what was moving around what, but like we weren't like completely totally off, right? So I guess that's how I would start to think about it, is like, is there like a blanket general falsehood or delusion, or is there errors of specificity here? I don't know how to decide that without bringing in something like a first cause argument, however, though. You see what I'm saying? And I don't know how to make up a mind of whether it's as question begging as you think, Jim, apart from other deeper metaphysical considerations. I mean, for me, it just kind of comes to like a point where to my mind, I just think we just need to kind of like bring in some other symmetry breakers or something like that. That's how I always kind of thought about this. I don't know. I just wanted to put that out there for consideration, right? You guys see what I'm saying there, though? Like with the Zeus example, it's like, yeah, probably it isn't the way maybe, again, and I'm not an expert in mythology, so I might throw out a crude example there, but to my mind, it seems like, okay, even if the specifics were wrong, generally, I think certainly the theist wants to say it still is the result of agency. It's just at a higher level, if you want to call it like that, right? And it's not incompatible with also giving a sort of etiological story as well, right? So I guess that's the other consideration here, is like multiple layers of explanation, whether they're compatible or whether they're exclusive. So I think there's just a lot of things to consider here. And I don't mean to messy or muddle the conversation, because Thomas, I'm sure you probably have a path you want to stay on. So take whatever of that you want to comment on, and please do so. And then we can keep storming forward.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have very few preconceptions about how this conversation should go, and I'm sort of having new thoughts. And so this is interesting to me. And one of the thoughts I'm having is the person who advances this kind of cognitive science debunking argument, should they say that, actually, this is, we have here grounds to be skeptical of all the deliverances of our agency detection device, even kind of like mundane ones. And I guess maybe they should say, yeah. I think
this was Nietzsche's point, by the way. Like, this is the whole thing behind Nietzsche's like acerbic, anti-epistemology.
Yeah, maybe if you really believed that the means by which you detect agency is sort of hyperactive and prone to give false positives, then yeah, that should lower your confidence in all of its deliverances, because you would think, well, this might be one of those times where it's a false positive. And maybe you could sort of circumscribe the errors and say, well, if I have, multiple senses involved, the odds of the false positive are much lower. So like when I'm in the forest and all I hear is the broken stick, and I think that's definitely a person, I should be suspicious of that. Maybe that was hasty. But when I see the person, smell the person, feel the person, now I can be more confident. Maybe they should just say that. But yeah, if you really thought that you got this hyperactive agency detection device, I guess you should be suspicious of all of its deliverances. But maybe that's not such a bad result. Maybe they would be willing to accept that. But I did want to maybe just add one thing to the conversation really quick, because as I said, there's two ways to respond to this sort of debunking argument. And
yeah, I cut you off after the first one. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. So one of them was try to say that, this mechanism that you're telling me isn't tracking the truth. It really is tracking the truth after all. That's one way you could go. But I think another way you could go, which might be a sort of, there's less resistance on this path, is to grant that I've got a kind of bias here. I've got a hyperactive agency detection device. And so like when I form beliefs about God, I should grant that I've got a kind of influence on me that isn't pushing me in the direction of truth. Okay. But that's not enough to show that that's the only influence on me. It could be that I've got like one influence pushing me in the wrong direction, but I've got even better influences pushing me in the direction of truth. So it's like, it would be like this, if you're on a jury and it's a criminal trial, and you form the belief that the defendant is guilty after the course of the trial. And then someone points out to you, well, that defendant has a face tattoo, and you're sort of biased against people with face tattoos. I would grant that. I'd say, yeah, I do have a bias against people with face tattoos. I'm probably going to be inclined to think that person committed the crime, whatever the crime was.
It says murderer, right?
Yeah. It says murderer on his forehead. So, yeah,
my mom.
I agree that inclines me in the direction of thinking he's guilty. But that's not enough to debunk my belief, because I might have really good reasons to think that he's guilty. Maybe the evidence was overwhelming, and like we've got videotape and a written confession and so on. So all that these cognitive science debunking arguments show is like, you've got one sort of bad influence on your belief. I think you can grant that and say that doesn't show that I'm not also influenced by arguments and evidence.
Yeah.
So just putting it in the context of like the elsewhere, else when sort of objection, what's being pointed out to me is like my parents played a role in the formation of my religious beliefs. Yeah, okay, I grant that. But they weren't the only thing. I also did a lot of reading and thought about it a lot. And I feel like I have really good reasons in favor of my belief. So I feel like I can just grant to the skeptic everything the skeptic's saying, except for the only bit when they say this was the only influence on you.
Yeah.
Or this was the primary influence on you. I just deny that and say, I don't think it was. Prove me wrong, smarty pants.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree completely.
That's always been my general approach.
You know, so a couple of things, like, you know, one, it's not just my religious beliefs that are subject to sociological pressure, right? I mean, I clearly would have different views about astronomy and mathematics and things like that too if I lived elsewhere, elsewhen, right? Mm-hmm. And the claim will be, well, yeah, but science is, you know, kind of it's exempt to that because of the scientific method. But, you know, it's
hugely challengeable depending on what branch of science we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And as you know, we could go like Paul Feyerabend and say, well, really show me the scientific method, right? That too seems to be subject to sociological pressure and assumptions and all that. Okay. So I think that's one, I think, an important piece in the debate is we're all in an elsewhere, elsewhen position with respect to science, if we're lay people, right, in that debate, right? This is like a question that I'd really love to hear your view on, Thomas, is I've often thought about this, is if you go with the sociological debunking, you're only religious because mom and dad told you to be, okay? And then you go the cognitive science route and say, no, you're religious because it's hardwired in some sense, or, you know, semi-hardwired, or, you know, soft-wired in us, right?
Yeah.
Those don't seem to fit together terribly well. Right? And what cog sci is showing us is, no, this isn't really a cultural, anthropological, or, you know, phenomenon. It's actually maybe an aspect of the human nervous system, right? Yeah. So it isn't elsewhere, elsewhen, right? And this is why it keeps popping up, however hard we try, is that it's in the nervous system, right? And I just wondered, do you think those two can sit together very well?
Yeah, I like that. I like where you're going there, and that's sort of a new thought to me too. But I think the idea is these little cognitive science setups that we have in our brain deliver just a kind of basic sort of supernaturalism that is then sort of sculpted by our cultural upbringing.
Sure.
And we could end up, you know, animists or polytheists or monotheists. But I think the idea is we're just set up to view the world teleologically, project agency out into the world, and then our culture and our parents and our schooling and so on directs that in various directions. So I think they'd say that is compatible. And maybe the reason why our parents are so successful at shaping our religious beliefs is partly because we come out primed to be religious. And then something else they like to say is kids also seem primed to just believe whatever their parents tell them when they're very small. They just kind of take your word for it, because if we weren't docile in this way, then we tend to die or something. Like our parents would tell us, don't go over there, there's alligators, and we'd say, I am a free thinker. I'm going to go see for myself, and then we're dead. So all the free thinkers got
standard story now.
So I guess there's this sort of convergence of factors. We're being primed by these hardwired bits of our brain to be religious and to trust our parents. And then societies have come up with all sorts of detailed views on what the supernatural world is like. And then those get instilled into us by teaching. I think that's what the skeptic would say.
Right. Yeah, I guess another question I have on this is, again, and I always come back to, I don't know how to decide this apart from other considerations that would help tilt the scales metaphysically one way or another, because not to bring in too much Plantinga, and it's been a while since I've refreshed myself on Plantinga, but like if God exists, then everything that you just described, like that all seems kind of expected and compatible. Right, that beliefs that could be true could also be useful and help us to survive, and right. So I guess I don't see an issue with that. And if God does not exist, I have a big. I guess I lean probably more towards. I would lean, if not into radical skepticism, I would be very nervous. Right, I would be very, very nervous.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago, and you can still watch this on YouTube. There were some people. There was a special where people put some like helmet on their head that like was a magnet or something, and it activated the God part of the brain.
Yeah, I remember this. Yeah,
it's coming out about like the God part of the brain, and it would sort of induce in people a kind of quasi-religious experience, or they'd feel like there was a presence. And then, so that was the evidence that was presented, and then they just went straight from that to the conclusion. It was like, in your face, religious believers, or something. And I just remember thinking, like, well, if theism's true, and if God exists, and if Christianity's true in particular, why would I be surprised that there's like a part of our brain that is sort of set up to deliver religious beliefs? That's exactly what I would expect. And okay, you're tampering it with this magnet, but we already knew we could tamper with brains with drugs and alcohol and so on. This is not really surprising.
That's not surprising at all.
You know, we could in principle do the same thing with seeing a red object.
Yeah, right.
Ergo,
yeah, it's called LSD. You know, just slip the person some LSD, and suddenly they see all this.
You know what I mean? Like we could, you know, I mean, another thing too is, well, there's another rabbit hole I'd love to go down on that, but yeah, in principle, we could make you see, you know, a color or something like that. Okay, that alone should not lead us to mistrust, you know, whether or not our color perceptions are veridical.
Yeah.
And in fact, that there's a part of the brain that, as its normal structure, is set up there, right, to register this, might actually say something in the favor, right, of there being something like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that maybe the hasty inference was, oh, look, you believe in God just because of this part of the brain that you have.
You've been too close. You've been too close to too many microwaves or something. Yeah.
Yeah, it's coming from this part of your brain. That's what's producing the belief.
I believe in induction because of a certain part of my brain too.
I know, yeah, but then the question is like, well, why is that part of my brain active, at least in the right sort of circumstances, not when you're running it through a magnet, but in the right sort of
the God helmet, that's what it was called, right?
Why is that part of my brain active? Well, it could be because God's activating it, you know? That's one possibility that you're just sort of ignoring or dismissing. So yeah, I think that's how the dialectic's going. The skeptic sees this part of the brain producing the belief and says, that couldn't be veridical. So look, I've got a debunking argument. Whereas the theist sees what's happening and says, oh, this is just like an ordinary kind of perception. Like I formed a belief because this part of my brain's active, and that part of my brain's active because that object really is out there in the world, causing it to be
activated. Right.
Yeah.
Let's have the science helmet now. Like the science helmet cause you to have, you know, does that mean
that's right?
Right. Can I go back to run back to some things we talked about a little bit earlier?
Yeah.
So I kind of want to think about this a little more structurally. So let's say, you know, we would assign, independent of any cognitive science concerns, just, you know, a 0.01 probability that Zeus exists, right? Something really low, right? Okay. And then we'll, you know, assign, you know, so as not to maybe beg too many questions, a 0.5 probability that there's that the monotheistic deity exists.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then let's say we go, I don't know, a 0.3 probability that our agency detection is running hyperactively in any one occurrence, right? So it's, and that's probably way too generous, right? It's probably much lower than that, right?
Right.
You said 0.3?
0.3, yeah.
I'm just writing these numbers down.
Yeah, and I'm pulling these out of my butt too. Okay, so, all right. Okay, so if I'm believing now in Zeus,
yes,
right, and that is okay. So and that's probabilistic bottom feeder 0.01, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The probability now of agency, you know, hyperactivity is much higher, right, than there actually being a Zeus. So then I would say, better explanation, right, of why I'm believing this is that it's hyperactive agency, right? Because the probability of the hyperactive agency is higher than the probability of there actually being such a thing as Zeus.
Well, I guess I'm a little confused because I thought these were like my own sort of personal credences, and you said we're going to assign a probability of 0.01 to Zeus. But then you said, so if I find myself believing that Zeus exists, I should prefer the hyperactive agency.
No. I mean more like you're a social scientist, right? And
So we see other people believing in Zeus. Yeah. That makes more sense.
Right.
Okay, so I think almost certainly Zeus doesn't exist. Here are all these people believing in Zeus. How shall I explain this?
Yeah.
And then I prefer the sort of cognitive science debunking explanation.
So I've got two explanations here. One, there's such a dude as Zeus, or there's something's gone wrong with their agency detection, right?
Yeah.
In that case, because Zeus is a probability bottom feeder, right? I'm going to go even with a low probability that the agency detection's off there. That's a better explanation. Okay. Okay, but let's say it's 50-50 that the monotheistic God exists.
Right.
And it's still on any one case that we would randomly select, it's still only 0.3 that there's hyperactive agency going on. Better explanation is still that there's a monotheistic God, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And maybe we could, you could just imagine a case where I'm wondering about my scientific colleague who's working on this project with me. And I believe there's an agent there, and I'm really quite confident. And so I'm not at all attracted to like, oh, this was just a hallucination foisted on me by my hyperactive agency device. So yeah, I guess, sometimes we accept these debunking arguments for our beliefs about agency, and sometimes we don't. And I guess the question you're asking is, what's the difference between these two cases?
Or just to say, I can see where it makes sense to give the genealogical, undercutting explanation when I already have some good reason to think that the belief to be explained is very unlikely to be true. Then it's true. A very good explanation.
Right.
So if it's the case, I can't say it's very likely that the belief is false or it's unlikely that it's true. Then I got to compare the probability of the hyperactivity on the agency detection against the probability of the belief that I'm trying to explain.
Right.
Its own intrinsic probability, right? And that's where I think the question bag comes in.
Yeah, I think that's right. So in the case of my scientific colleague, and I believe there's an agent here, and if I ask myself, why do I believe this? It's not just the little agency detector I have that's projecting agency out there. I guess I would say I've got evidence independent of that from my other senses, and I've got all these memories and so on. And so there it becomes, putting it in explanationist terms, it becomes more plausible to say, I believe it because it's true.
It's true. Interesting.
I don't believe it just because of this agency detector.
Right.
I believe it because it's true.
Yeah.
With Zeus, I guess we're more inclined to say, well, the only reason you believe that is, and then it's stuff that doesn't have to do with
and let's I want to focus on Zeus again. So I guess if if by Zeus we mean the cartoon, right, of the physical, very powerful bearded guy who's voiced by the actor in the movie Dodgeball in the cartoon Hercules, whatever that version of Zeus is on the mountain, right? Then it seems like what I would expect to be the case if Zeus existed, like, isn't the case, right? Like, I go up on the mountain, there's no guy there, right? But if by Zeus in history, you read certain thinkers who talk about Zeus, it's kind of like they're just talking about monotheism in other respects as well. So that, again, I'm not an expert on that, but yeah, if it's the former case, it seems like what I would expect to be there aren't the sort of things that are actually there if that were the case. But in monotheism, right, and this, I guess, just comes back to what I was talking about before, like, do we have independent considerations? It's like, well, if there's, an immaterial, eternal creator and sustainer of the universe, are the sorts of things there that I might expect to be there. Like, if I have independent reasons to think that the universe is contingent and contingency demands necessity, or maybe I look at fine tuning, or even the moral beliefs, right, or something like that. It seems like the types of things that I would expect, given that conception of deity, are kind of things that I run into, versus the kind of things I would expect if Zeus from the Disney movie were true, like, aren't the kind of things I run into. So I guess my question is I mean, this is where I've always come on this, right? I've always come to the point of just realizing what are my other reasons, right? Is there some sort of other independent considerations that we would have to give here there? Because I wouldn't even know how to begin to assign a probability on Zeus apart from those types of considerations, right? I don't know if that was helpful to the conversation at all.
You're wondering what reasons you have not to believe in Zeus as depicted in like Greek popular religion?
Yeah. Like I just watched the Disney movie again the other day, so I'm pretty up to speed here.
Pretty up to speed
on Zeus. Right.
Well, yeah, my understanding is that, you know, well, I'm not a historian and certainly not a Greek historian, but my understanding was in Greek popular religion, people actually did believe in like these stories, and they thought there really were multiple gods who were active in various ways and impregnated human women and so on. But I think you're right that some philosophers, one that I encountered in doing research for this Elsewhere, Elsewhen paper was Xenophanes, were critical of Greek popular religion and advocated for kind of like monotheistic god.
Like I'm thinking like a Seneca. When Seneca talks about Zeus, he seems to really mean like a general monotheism, right?
This is probably what got Socrates killed, right? So,
but that's a whole nother conversation, and we can bring in better experts than us with this for that.
Just as a funny aside, you know, you mentioned Zeus's very active love life, Thomas.
Did I?
Yeah, no, Thomas. So, when my kids were young, my kids are mostly older now, but I read them this wonderful adaptation of Hades, right? And the way they dealt with this is Zeus kept coming down to earth and marrying women, right? He kept marrying all these women, right? And my kids were very, very perplexed by all the marrying that went on Zeus's part, right? And so, and I think at a certain point in the midst, somebody married a bull too, right? So it was,
oh boy,
it was very carefully sanitized, but yet, you know, like it led to some interesting conversations.
Yeah. Okay,
so marriage.
Yeah, all this marrying going on.
Yeah. So sorry to derail the conversation. You guys get it back on track however you want. Yeah,
this is part of the beauty of the Pat Flynn show. So, so if I can go back to that one example we were working with, Thomas. So let's say you're an agnostic scientist, right? And you have a subject come in, and you know you're a cognitive scientist, and you've found it's a 1 in 3 shot that the agency detector goes off, and in your agnostic view, it's 50-50 that monotheism is true. Okay, and so now your experimental subject is a monotheist. Okay, and this is all you know. Like this is all you know, right? I think you'd have to say in that case the more likely explanation of the two options in front of you, the cognitive science debunked explanation versus the explanation that there is in fact a monotheistic God, right? That's the source of this belief, right? The belief is true. You'd have to say the better explanation would be the truth of monotheism, right?
So situation is your prior probability in theism is 0.5, and you're not so sure about this hyperactive agency detection explanation that was at like 0.3.
It's like, in any one case of agency detection, you're saying it's a 1 in 3 shot that it's wrong.
Oh, it's a 1 in 3 shot that it's wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I guess...
I think it's a pretty liberal estimate, right?
Yeah. Yesterday in my philosophy of religion class, I actually walked students through a little spreadsheet I made where I just designed it so they could plug in values in the Bayes theorem and see how their confidence in theism should change based on how they evaluate the evidence that we considered in the course. And that's only the second time I've done it, and I thought students will not enjoy this. This is too mathy and technical, but they really love it. And so as you talk me through this, I'm like, well, I feel like we should actually just plug this in the Bayes theorem.
I know.
That would make for some pretty boring radio, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right.
But I think we can at least say this. So this kind of reminds me of the situation that some people are in with their, these days, like people are taking COVID tests, and the COVID tests that we have, especially the like take-home tests, the ones you do at home, aren't very reliable. And they give a lot of false negatives, and maybe they give false positives too. And we already know that COVID isn't very widespread in the population, at least these days, in California anyway. And so like you take this take-home test and maybe it gives you a positive result. Well, given like the way that base rate fallacy works, you probably shouldn't believe that you have COVID just on the basis of that one test. Yeah. Because there's so many false positives, and because the prior probability that you had the disease was so low, even a positive result from a fairly reliable test could be almost certainly wrong. Yeah. So maybe something like that is happening here if you think that this little hyperactive agency detection explanation is usually wrong. Yeah. And you think that there's actually a pretty good chance that God exists, then yeah, maybe the math will shake out so that you should think the better explanation here is.
But I don't think we should say anything that's in our like basic evolutionarily conditioned hardware is usually wrong. Because otherwise you're gonna have a hard time explaining why it's there, right?
Oh, well, I don't know.
So that's why I was setting it at a 1 in 3 probability that it's wrong.
Here's something. Well, we seem to be hardwired to be attracted to things like sugar and fat and salt and so on. Our brains reward us for that. And maybe we form beliefs like this is the sort of thing that I should eat. In ancestral environments, that was a good idea because those higher energy food sources were so rare. But at least now, in our current environments, this gets people into a lot of trouble. Yeah. So I think sometimes like our hardwired evolutionary inheritances can give us beliefs that are mostly false, at least in some areas.
Yeah, I agree. But in like one, we could ask like if we did an induction over the whole history of higher apes that have that particular, carbohydrate fat seeking mechanism, right? In fact, it's probably been mostly right. It's, just the last 25 years that we quit eating real food. That's a problem, right?
Well, yeah, it depends on what the belief in question is, and I don't really know if people form these sorts of conscious beliefs. But if the belief is like I should eat as much of this as possible or something like that,
yeah. And I'll tell you because this is kind of where I do a good amount of work, and I think most people would say I know I shouldn't be eating this much, but I can't stop.
Yeah. Yes, maybe the right description of them is like they've got kind of inconsistent beliefs. Yeah. They sort of believe that I really should eat this, but also I believe I shouldn't. But I could think of another example real quick. So there's all these sorts of evolutionary explanations given for why humans are so xenophobic and tribalistic. And I guess one explanation is there's this like parasite explanation. Like back in ancestral environments, groups of humans shared parasites. And so we all got sort of immune to various kinds of diseases. And then if somebody from another tribe came along, there's a real risk that they're going to give you a disease that you didn't have before. And so we started getting really distrustful of foreigners, people who didn't look like us and who didn't know. And I guess in ancestral environments, that might have been adaptive anyway. But these days it causes a lot of trouble. And
So Thomas, go ahead, Jim. And
so I agree. Like I think we come up with examples where a certain mechanism that came online has like outlived its usefulness, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That's why I would say, there is some significant probability that, say, agency detection is going wrong, right? But I don't know that we would go over 50% on that, right? Because it seems like, for the most part, when I think someone's talking to me, someone actually is, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so, and so. This is I kind of what I'm teasing at here is the use of the term hyperactive agency detection system, right? The hyperactivity, and it's only hyperactive when it goes wrong. Like we've got an agency detection system, right? When it goes wrong, I tell you what we mean by hyperactivity is when it's going wrong, when it's overstepped and it's saying there's agency that's there, that's really not, right? And the question is in any one case, how likely is it that it's operating in that hyperactive manner?
Mm-hmm.
And I think in the issue that you're dealing with, then the question is in any run randomly selected case of attempted agency detection, what's the probability that it's wrong in that case, right? Leaving aside the content of the belief, right?
Yeah.
So what's the likelihood that it's wrong in that case? Okay.
It would be hard to say. Like we can do it with
hard to say.
COVID tests and so on.
Yeah,
but something else that I think is worth pointing out is that belief forming methods, like when you're assessing their reliability, it's usually relativized to contexts or circumstances. So that, you know, you might have, like, maybe your metal detector is very reliable at some temperatures, but at very high temperatures, it's unreliable.
Yeah.
Maybe COVID tests are reliable when you put the swab up your nose and less reliable when you put it in your mouth or in your armpit or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, and so maybe I'm just going to have to speak up for the religious skeptic again. Maybe what they'd say is, like, in some contexts, your agency detection device is not bad. But in other contexts, it's more likely to err. Yeah. And which sort of contexts are those? Oh, when, like, the only evidence you have is sort of secondhand indirect effects that you attribute to an agency, like erupting volcanoes and thunder and so on. Yeah. In those sort of circumstances, it's way more likely you're just getting a false positive from your agency detector. But, you know, when your friend is right next to you in good lighting and you project agency onto him, hey, that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But see, I think that's kind of the point I'm trying to make, which is, I agree, like how we set that likelihood of error is, like, if we go, it's context relevant, and then we say part of the context is whether or not it's a religious belief. Well, then bang, I think now we've just begged all the questions against whether or not religious beliefs are inherently unreliable, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's one way that the religious believer could respond and say, maybe I
think the only fair way to conduct a debate is say, okay, let's look at what's the probability of, say, just using monotheism, right? Mm-hmm. Not, you know, like the Blessed Mother is talking to me when I'm in the shower or something like that, right? But just like, you know, monotheism, and then independently of, like, begging the question about whether or not religious belief is inherently unreliable, what's the likelihood in any one case that my agency detection is off, and then compare those probabilities? I think then that becomes an interesting question.
Yeah. One thing I want to throw in here is funny, Thomas, because we were talking about seemed like a flavor of proper functionalism according to naturalism, right? As long as it's in this situation, right, we could maybe have more confidence it's functioning properly. But beyond that, and then again, like, I'm just back to where I always am on this, right? Because, like, well, if theism is true, well, and you know, that's Planiga, right? Is that general reliability, assuming that you know, we're not malfunctioning and we're in the environment that it's supposed to be sort of situated in, right? That's the kind of the theistic flavor of that. Now, whether we think that that's good or interesting or correct is another story. But even for the naturalist, then, okay, maybe these detection devices we have, we can try and draw like some principled fencing, right? Where we can say, okay, if we're in this fence, then we can have some confidence that maybe it's generally reliable. If we go beyond this fence, we start looking at, you know, it's not something we can grab hold of, it's not something we can taste, touch, whatever. Then maybe it's not reliable. I think, yeah, I'd be curious your thoughts of how that sort of restrictedness would impinge or kind of burn through reliability in other aspects of our beliefs, right? And you actually I don't think I've read it, but you have a paper on evolutionary debunking arguments, don't you, Thomas? That only all naturalists should worry about. Isn't that something like the take on that? Because whatever else epiphenomenalism is, like, I don't see what the immediate connection there is to survival value, right, of holding a belief like that necessarily. So I don't know if that connects to anything that you have in your paper, but I'm trying to see, like, what type of principled fencing could be put around this this detection equipment of ours that itself wouldn't open the door to a more radical skepticism. And I'm having a hard time trying to discern what that would be. Maybe there is. I'm not saying that there isn't, but again, like for the theist, I don't think you have as much of an issue, because you could say, yeah, it's generally reliable, it can go wrong here or there, but it's probably not going to, and we might have to tune our specifics, right? And we have good reasons to believe in God. So, you know, there really is a universe that's suffused with agency, at least at some level. But for the naturalist, how do you put those principled restrictions in place without inviting a greater, very problematic skepticism, I guess, is my question.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. So you're probably familiar with Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism,
yes,
where he tries to show that, like, if naturalism and evolution are true, then we get it, an undercutting defeater for all of our beliefs, no matter what sort of method or mechanism you were using, perception, memory, intuition, all of it. It all gets undermined if evolution and naturalism are both true. And I guess the sort of pushback he's received, or the area where that seems least plausible, is just kind of like ordinary cases of perception. Could I really not trust my eyes when they tell me that, like, there's a cliff here, or there's a tiger over there, or something like that? And I mean, Plantinga spends a lot of time trying to convince you that even these beliefs would be undermined on naturalism and evolution. And I guess the idea is something like, although you find yourself believing that as you look at a tiger, there's a tiger there, it could have happened that you held this belief even if it was false or something like that. So he tries to show that, you know, if evolution went the way that the naturalist says it goes, surely, at least when it comes to beliefs about, you know, my environment and medium-sized objects in my environment, evolution would see to it that I believe in these things because they're really there. Or at least that would be, like, more efficient than giving me radically false beliefs that happen to produce the right behavior. The easiest way to produce the right behavior is give me the accurate beliefs. And evolution loves efficiency. So I don't mean to, like, endorse that line of thought. I'm just telling you that in response to Plantinga, people really get hung up on the.
And I think there's kind of like two kind of responses to that. It's been a while since I've freshened up on Plantinga, like I said. But one is that it seems like all this belief forming and consciousness itself is quite inefficient, right? So, like, why is that even there? We just need the right physical patterns, right? And then if I'm remembering Plantinga right, he wants to say that probably if you're going to give an evolutionary story, you are going to be at least heading in the direction of epiphenomenalism, and the causal directionality there seems to be relevant. That your beliefs could be literally anything, right? As long as the physical patterns are in place, it doesn't matter what your beliefs are, and especially if there isn't a feedback, right, going in the other direction. I think, what is he gives the example of oh, it's been a minute, like maybe you think you're playing chess with your friends, but you're actually swimming in a pool of crocodiles or something like that. Yeah. Right now, this seems like so radically insane. I think that's part of his point, right? But I don't want to take us too far down into Plantinga's argument, because it's been a while since I've read it. But I think the efficiency, if you're looking for efficiency, I think we might have an issue with consciousness and belief formation in general to some extent. Yeah. And then we have the concerns about epiphenomenalism and the sort of floating atop the physical patterns of these different beliefs, right?
Well, yeah, let me say this. So I'm not sure what to say about the case of perception, and maybe Plantinga is right that naturalism and evolution do give you an undermining defeater for all of your beliefs, no matter where they came from. Mm-hmm. But I'm much more confident when it comes to moral beliefs. And I think even there, like, naturalists are more skeptical of their moral beliefs, because, like, again, with perception of ordinary sized objects in our environment, it's kind of plausible that we hold these beliefs because of the little methods that we have in our skulls to produce them. And those methods are operating the way they do because the objects are really out there. Okay, but what's less plausible is that the same thing holds for our moral beliefs, that, you know, we believe that, for example, incest is wrong because it really is wrong. Right. The evolutionary story seems to be pretty plausibly debunking, because the evolutionary story is something like, we believe incest is wrong because it tends to produce mutant babies who have higher rates of having, two deleterious mutations, two broken alleles, and then they get all these genetic diseases and so on. So that's why we believe incest is wrong. But notice we didn't have to actually assume that incest is wrong in the explanation of why we believe it's wrong. And so there are far more naturalists who are willing to swallow the skepticism pill when it comes to morality than when it comes to just perception of our immediate environment. And so that's why I wrote that paper, because I thought, I think we got him here. I think we can convince a naturalist that you can't really be a moral realist if you're a naturalist.
Right.
Yeah. And I think
that's a cost, right? And that's what we were talking about in our previous podcast. Is maybe the best we can do sometimes, if we're just staying like right in this particular domain without just doing like a separate metaphysical project, is just show, okay, here's the costs, right? And just start weighing that out, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And then, unfortunately, I was going to say, unfortunately, it's a free country, but that's not right. Fortunately, it's a free country. But unfortunately, what that means is even after you sort of lay out all these costs for somebody, they still just might bite the bullet.
Bite the bullet, yeah.
Right. I mean, Alex Rosenberg wrote that book, An Atheist's Guide to Reality. It's just chapter after chapter of bullet biting. He just says, there's no intentionality, there are no persons, there are no moral facts, and this should all be celebrated. And I'm like, I have my students read it, and I'm like, read this, students, see?
Right. Yeah. No, we were going to do an episode on one of his papers as well, where he's kind of calling out he quotes more teary-eyed naturalists for not being more consistent in following through to this bullet biting, not just on being a moral nihilist, but all these other aspects as well. So he'll bite a trough of bullets. And I actually appreciate that for a number of different reasons. I actually really
I wonder if his fellow naturalists think like you're just giving a big fat gift to our opponents.
He's kind of like a Peter Singer in that sense. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, you sort of applaud when somebody sees the implications of their view. You applaud that part at least.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you guys mind if I riff on the Planck evolutionary argument a little bit? Because I'd love to hear Thomas's views on some of these things. So I've been thinking, I used to be a very big proponent of it, and now lately I've kind of been rethinking it a little bit. Just like the other day on a long car ride, I found myself thinking about it. So, one thing, and I haven't been really thick in the more recent literature on it, right? But one thing I worry about now is an ambiguity between if we accept an evolutionary story about our faculties, an exclusive evolutionary story about our faculties, to say, okay, there's some probability that everything we think is false because, what really matters is, getting dates and winning fights in sub-Saharan Africa 100,000 years ago, right? Not truth, right? Okay, that's one thing we could say, but also we could just say, well, it's not a question of whether or not we're getting the world right. It's that there's a lot of ways the world could be gotten right, and the one that we're particularly inclined towards is one among many, right? So we have a way of dividing the world up in terms of middle-sized goods that is, relative to our sensory capacities and the size of animals that we are, and like its interaction with the evolution of upright posture and our way of like reaching and grabbing and touching and stuff like that leads to a certain generalized, view of the way things run in the universe. And we could admit that had we evolved differently, we would have a different, sort of set of base intuitions about the universe, right? We know that there are animals with other senses that have access to other things than we do. Okay. I think one could admit that and not be in any trouble with saying that our story about reality is unreliable, right? It really is true that there's a chair that Pat's sitting on right now, or a stool that Pat's sitting on right now.
Mm-hmm.
And even though there could be another perfectly good way to cut up the world wherein those kinds of objects don't show up, right? And we could admit that our position there is evolutionarily conditioned such that we're breaking the world up that way. But yet it's still perfectly true that the world is that way. Right.
Right. Yeah.
I'm saying, I think there might be a softer way the naturalists could sort of account for the evolutionary contingency of our cognitive faculties without saying, well, therefore they're probably wrong, right? Or even very likely wrong.
Well, yeah, I guess for there, you know, I would be curious, like how we would deal with the sort of moral realism there, because again, like I think
I'm leaving that aside.
Because like for example, like let's just take that up for a minute, right? It's like, as a theist, I don't see an incompatibility, right? So if you're a theist, you think God guided the evolutionary process. Well, presumably we evolved to not invent a bunch of things about reality, but detect a bunch of things about reality, right? Yeah. So that includes a sort of moral fabric, if you want to call it that, right? Yeah. And, you know, not infallible. Nobody wants to say it's infallible. Now, if you're a Christian, you have a story about a fall that you might bring into your epistemological project, which is certainly interesting, right? But we can bracket that off. But at least a general reliability, we might say, if you're a theist. And so then it might also be the case, I think it actually is the case, that beliefs we have, moral beliefs, it's true, like rape not only really is wrong, but it also tends to be conducive to a flourishing society as well, right? So I just don't think there's an incompatibility.
Rape's being wrong is conducive.
Yes, our belief of rape being wrong is conducive, right? Yeah, but it also is a true belief, right? Yeah. It really does. I
know.
It really is an objective.
I'm only worried about the perceptual stuff.
Okay, because all right. So what? Yeah. So see, there I don't. Right, like maybe there's something around me right now that my cognitive receiving set just can't pick up, right? Because of how I evolved and the way I was. Maybe the way I was designed, right? That maybe bats could pick up or something. Yeah. But would that save the naturalist though? Because presumably Planet could still say, well, maybe you just evolved not to pick up anything and just project a bunch of crap to the world, right?
Sure, sure. Right. I mean, but so then we're going to go to how likely is that? So it seems like to me, like the Planet position presumes that it's, like fairly highly probable, maybe not even, it's enough to concern you. It's probable enough to concern you that we evolved a completely, misguided worldview, right? In order to, for survival reasons, right? Well, I don't see anything to really pump that probability up that happened, right? And I think that the scenario I'm laying out here is you could give a lot to the evolutionary story and say, yeah, it is contingent. It could have gone other ways. It's not just truthfulness that's pushing it, right? And still say, yeah, but it still might be reliable given the way it went down.
I'm going to let Thomas chime in here.
Yeah, I'm thinking through this. I'm not. Yeah, let me see if I understand it. Yeah. So the idea was, you said there could be many ways to get the world right. And this was all sort of suggested on behalf of the naturalist. This is a way that a naturalist could respond to planning it.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining a naturalist saying, there are many sort of conceptual schemes that we might have adopted, but that doesn't mean that only one of them is true, because there are different ways of carving up the world that could be true. And at first that struck me as like, what? That can't be right. But then I thought, well, maybe that is right, because there is some evidence that we have carved up the world in a way that doesn't really match the world. That is, we have these categories in our language, and we track these kinds that aren't natural kinds. And I guess some examples that come to mind are trees. I'm told by like biologists that that's not really a useful category, because the difference between like a tree and a shrub isn't really a difference in kind. And some of the things we consider trees are really just big shrubs or something like that. I don't know.
Coyotes versus wolves, right?
What's that?
Coyotes versus wolves.
Well, yeah, I guess because they can have babies, you mean? They can reproduce?
I mean, just.
Well, here's another one. Bugs. People talk about bugs. and we track bugs, and we want to kill bugs, and you buy bug spray. But included in that category of bugs are like insects and arachnids, and then those other ones that I can't remember right now that look like spiders but aren't even arachnids, but I forget what they're called. But anyway, we like pretty much any creepy crawly thing we call a bug, but that's not a natural kind.
Right.
But still, there are bugs.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's an example in which we have imposed the kind of conceptual scheme on the world, and we track this kind, but it's not a natural kind. So I'm with you there, but I guess what I'm not quite seeing yet is how does this help the naturalist?
Because I think the naturalist, I think part of the background, right, that in these kinds of like anti-naturalist arguments is if you go the evolutionary route, you have to sort of say that there's a real serious contingency in the way things went down, and they didn't have to go down that way, and they could have gone down other ways, obviously. And what was driving it was not just, that was not just getting the world right, but it was getting the world right in a way that was conducive to, reproductive ends, right? Yeah. And I think a naturalist could say, yeah, like the whole thing is contingent. It could have gone differently, right? It's not it's not entirely driven by truth in some sort of theoretical sense, right?
Yeah.
And yet, still, your basic perceptual beliefs could be true in a sense, right? They are based on a way of carving up the world, right, that was useful to our ancestors, even if there's other, even better ways of carving up the world, like, say, physics or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I think Plantinga could grant that, like, there are different ways of carving up the world. Some of them successfully track natural kinds. Others are tracking these weird disjunctive kinds, like bugs. But I thought Plantinga's worry was, it could be that, like, you find yourself believing there's a bug in front of me.
Yeah.
And you're wrong, not because this isn't a natural kind, but because there's nothing there at all or something like that.
Yeah.
So even if there are, like, ways of carving up the world that are true, even though they're sort of different ways, he's worried that, like, we didn't land in any of those. We landed in falsehood, straight up falsehood, not just the unnatural kinds, but falsehood.
And this has always been a thing that I've had a hard time understanding with the argument is, it seems to me we have to then ask ourselves, how likely is it that we would end up in falsehood about perceptual beliefs?
Yeah, and I think what he says, doesn't he say, if I had known we were going to talk about this.
Yeah, we all could have read where the conflict lies before this conversation. So if we misrepresent Plantinga, forgive us.
I thought his view was, he just tries to convince you that if naturalism is true, then the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable is low or inscrutable.
Yes, that's
so
right.
even if you just can't assign a probability to it, he thinks that's enough to get the defeater.
Yeah.
In order to avoid the defeater, you've got to have reason to believe that your cognitive faculties are reliable. The probability that they're reliable is high. It can't be low or inscrutable. It's got to be high. And so why does he think that you can't reasonably believe it's high? He gives you all these possibilities. He's like, well, it could have been that. You think you're being chased by a tiger, or you are being chased by a tiger, but you believe it's just a race and you're hallucinating a tiger, and that's the signal that the race has started. So yeah, he just kind of tells you all these possibilities and then expects you to conclude, oh, I can't rule those out, so probability my cognitive faculties are reliable is low or inscrutable.
Right. Yeah. I just wonder, do I have to rule those out? Do I have to rule them out? Right.
Yeah. Is it enough to just raise these skeptical possibilities and then say, on the basis of these possibilities I can't rule out, I must conclude the probability that my faculties are reliable is low or inscrutable? Yeah, I don't know. Unfortunately, like, knowledge is a very fragile thing, and it's easy to destroy. And all you got to do is just bring up possibilities that can't be ruled out. And they're not entirely implausible, giving a particular kind of physicalist story either. Because apparently, I think the general, fairly safe presumption here is that those physical patterns largely are going to be there before consciousness even comes on the scene, right? What physical patterns? What do you mean?
Right, whatever gets you to, and this is where it gets tricky, because like whatever gets you to avoid bears and reproduce, right? But like that's a belief itself, that, you know what I'm saying? So like, is that really what we're even doing if Plantinga's argument goes through, right? And I guess he would say, well, we might not even be able to know that. So it's a fascinating argument. It's something I haven't looked at for a while. But
let's suppose that naturalists can come up with a way that epiphenomenalism is not the case, right? Okay, because I think that, like, there's two questions, and I've often found this ambiguous in this debate. You might say, yeah, so if naturalism is true, you know, and the best the naturalists can do is some kind of, you know, reductive theory or identity theory or something like that. And of course, that's to be debated, right? Then there's a question of, like, in what sense does belief play any role whatsoever in evolution? Okay, right. Let's leave that aside. Let's suppose that the naturalists can have some non-epiphenomenal story, right? So where belief does make a behavioral difference. Okay. And I'm not arguing, just setting aside for a second. One of the things along the lines that we were doing that I've said, like, to students in, you know, when I'm motivating Plantinga's argument, is I'll say, well, I use this example. You know, you've got two monkeys in a forest, right? And there's a fire, and one of the monkeys, you know, sees the fire and has the belief, you know, that the mean kinetic energy of the molecules composing my body is going to go up at a high rate and thereby dissipate them, right? And the other one says, oh, you know, the fire demons are back and they're going to take me, you know, to the land of woe, right? Well, either way, both monkeys leave the forest and get a date that day, right? Okay. And so there you have a false belief and a true belief, you know, at least, you know, are both adaptive in that case, right? All right. Now, and when I've tried to motivate it, you know, I've always thought, well, because we should, okay, but maybe it seems like we have to, like, ask ourselves, like, which one is more likely to be spit out by the evolutionary process, right? And I wonder, is it maybe the case, though, for every true belief that would get you out of the fire, right? There's, like, infinitely many false beliefs that would do it too, right? Because there's really no constraint on convenient false belief, whereas there is a constraint, namely the world, on convenient true belief. And if that's the case, then that would seem to, like, pump up the probability on Plantinga's position pretty high. But I just don't know, is it true that for every true belief in a situation, there's infinitely many false ones? I don't know, right?
Yeah, as I recall, I think that Plantinga does some, like, math, or he says he had a mathematician friend do the math, and he's like, you know, given all the possibilities, the odds that you end up with mostly true beliefs is, like, astronomically small. So that's why you should think the probability that your cognitive faculties are reliable is pretty low. But here's a thought I'm having right now, and maybe I'll just throw this out there and see what you think. And it was actually I came across this thought listening to John Danaher speak recently. So he's a really famous jiu-jitsu coach who has a background in philosophy, and he was talking about jiu-jitsu and the way he teaches it to his students. And he said what he tries to do is teach a few basic concepts or heuristics that pack as much information as possible into them. So a few basic rules that if you just learn those, you'll be able to deduce, like, the right thing to do in many different circumstances. And I was like,
he's right about that, by the way. But yeah,
you what?
I think he's right about that, by the way.
Yeah,
too.
I think he's right about that too. But what was really interesting and relevant to our current conversation is he mentioned that, I don't know, based on some background reading he had done, maybe this is like basic cog sci or something, but the human mind is sort of designed to look for those sorts of rules or heuristics, or I guess we could even call them theories, that are as simple as possible and pack as much information to them as possible. And so, yeah, I guess this was in the context of a discussion of, like, chess playing machines and artificial intelligence, and one advantage that humans have over machines, and it's a smaller and smaller advantage as the machines progress, but something that we do is we try to learn heuristics or rules and then apply those, whereas you can just program the chess playing computer to, like, run through all the possibilities and do the calculations, and they have the power to do that. We don't have the power to do that, so we rely on simple, elegant theories that pack a lot of information in them. And so I was thinking about this case you described with the two monkeys, and one of the monkeys has this belief about mean kinetic energy of gas molecules, and the other has this belief about fire demons. Well, one advantage that the first monkey has is that little rule that he's following will give him the right results in other circumstances where the fire demon one might not. And so the rule that he's following packs more useful information into it that will be advantageous in other contexts. Whereas this fire demon one is going to get the monkey to run away. There's a forest fire, but it might not do the same when he's cooking or something. I don't know. These monkeys don't cook, but whatever. Some other context, the fire demon's going to rise. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? And so maybe the naturalist, because this was all supposed to help the naturalist.
Is going to have.
We're trying to help. We're trying to help the naturalist here. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to speak on behalf of the naturalist so much, but I do have a kind of contrarian streak, I guess.
No, Thomas, I do too, right? And I would rather, tease it out and get it right.
Nobody wants to be too quick here, right? Yeah. Nobody wants to be too quick, right? We're trying to get to the truth. I wish Planaga was here. Yeah, exactly. Al, if you're listening in the stream, we'll bring you in. If you want to bring us up on anything. Yeah. An argument from reason I actually really like. I do not remember the details, but I remember it actually struck me as being even more forceful than Planaga's version was phasers in his Philosophy of Mind book, but it was from a computational theory of mind. So I want to if people are kind of interested in this type of discussion, I would say check that one out. I thought it was pretty neat, but I feel like I'm probably already doing a disservice to Planaga's version. I don't want to do that to anybody else at this point.
You can find me defending this argument in Mind, Matter, Nature too. So.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. So let's go back here. So we talked about. Let's go back now and switch sides again. And now, in defense of the religious believer, Thomas, well, kind of because obviously you were not. You're still. You probably weren't even a Catholic at the time when you first encountered this because you're a convert, correct? So obviously you weren't taken in by these types of debunking arguments, right? Because you're Catholic, right? So where do you how do you specifically, if you were to summarize, how does explanationism then, how does that help against this sort of general religious skepticism that you first encountered when you were reading Churchland and them, right?
You mean that Paul Churchland?
Elsewhere else then, right?
Yeah. So it took me a while to. I think I now understand the way the argument's supposed to go, but it took a long time, and I kind of went full circle because I encountered the Paul Churchland statement of the argument, but then I found other statements from like John Hick and Xenophanes and John Stuart Mill and Rene Descartes. All these people give these sorts of elsewhere else when kind of skeptical arguments, and some of them, like most of them, quite explicitly rely on the counterfactual. If you had been born elsewhere, you would have had different beliefs. And so that triggered in me the thought that they are relying on one of these like modal constraints on knowledge, what philosophers call safety or sensitivity or something like that. Some philosophers think that if you want to define knowledge or analyze knowledge, what's going to show up in the definition is something like a counterfactual. And so when I read these skeptical arguments and they featured counterfactuals, I thought, they're telling me that these counterfactual conditions on knowledge are being violated, and so that's why there's no knowledge. But when you read the Churchland argument, it sounds more like he's saying the problem with religious belief is the explanation of where it comes from. And it's just from early teaching and socialization or something like that. Not from a sort of method that is influenced by the truth or something like that. And so when I read it again, like 15 years later after first encountering it, I was like, I think he's doing that bad explanation sort of argument. And so, yeah, again, I think the best way to understand this argument is they're telling you, you don't really hold your religious beliefs because they're true. You hold them because your parents told you. And your parents told you that because their parents told them, etc. And then I guess we just let the story peter out. But like Because from a Christian perspective, what we'd like is this chain of testimony goes all the way back to the truth, and then it's not such a big deal. You're like, yeah, my parents told me because their parents told them because somebody else told them, and the testimony goes back to the apostles, and that's fine with me.
Right.
But I guess what these skeptics have in mind is your parents told you that these religious beliefs are true, not because the religious beliefs really are true, but because they were raised in a certain kind of culture. And actually, in my own life, that was quite a salient possibility. On my mom's side of the family, there was a lot of Catholicism in their background, but they raised my mom Lutheran. And one time I asked them, and that's why my parents met, and that's why I exist, and that's why I was raised Lutheran. And so one time I asked my mom's parents, why did you raise my mom Lutheran rather than Catholic? And they said, well, when we moved to Chicago, the Lutheran church was the nearest one to our house. I was like, oh, don't say that. That's the worst thing you could say. That was really disorienting to me, because then I started feeling the pressure of this kind of skeptical argument. Like,
right.
I'm Lutheran because my parents taught me to be Lutheran, but my parents taught me to be Lutheran because of this real estate decision. Not because it's true, because of convenience, and they bought a house near a church. And so I think that's what the skeptic has in mind. Like, if we trace
Right.
back the explanation of your belief, it's not going to terminate in the truth.
It's not going to come from the apostles as reliable witnesses. It's going to come from a real estate decision. Right.
Something like that. Yeah, social pressure. I don't know, trying to fit in. Yeah. Yeah, and I guess actually, if you on that, just one more small story, a little bit of autobiography. On that Cuban side of my family, there were some Jewish converts from Portugal who converted for like business reasons, because they wanted like business transactions to be easier, and they didn't want to be Jewish anymore, so they became Christian. And so like there again, if you find out that like that was the origin of your religious beliefs, then it's not an explanation that crucially involves truth. And so then I think you probably should be worried if that really is why you hold your religious beliefs. But yeah, just at the risk of repeating myself, I think the right response is to say, that's part of the explanation of my religious beliefs. Yes, I do believe as I do because of what my parents taught me. But also, I've thought about it, and I've done my own research.
Right.
I mean, this is the sort of response that skeptics will give you when you turn the argument on them and say, why don't you have to be skeptical of your beliefs on religious topics? After all, if you had been born and raised in Pakistan, you probably would have been a Muslim, etc.
Cuts both ways, sure.
Yeah, and what they say is, well, I thought about it, you know?
Yeah. Well, I thought about it too.
I thought about it too. So
let's talk about those reasons, right? And we can just So let me ask you this then, because I am curious. I know Tyler McNabb has done a lot of work in epistemology in relation to tradition. So I mean, like, it seems like the three of us here would be able to, give reasons. Here's why I became, here's why I came into the church. Here's why Jim stayed in the church. Here's why Thomas came into the church. But what about hypothetical Grandma Betsy, right? And she grows up in Italy, and she was just taught to pray the rosary every night, and it was all just handed to her by her parents and immediate culture and surrounding family, and she never rolled up her sleeves and did any metaphysics. She didn't even know what metaphysics was. She never tried to study the history of it at all. Is she completely unjustified, right, in her Catholic faith at that point, or are there other means, maybe, or would you be allowed to factor in certain religious experiences maybe Grandma Betsy had, or how would you handle a case like that, if you see what I'm getting at?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah, if the question is she unjustified, I guess that depends on what justification is, and I'm not totally sure, but I think it might be, to be justified is to be able to prove that you know, or show that you know, to provide evidence which indicates that you believe something because it's true. And so she may not be able to do that, and so she may be unjustified. But on explanationism, justification is not required for knowledge. As long as she believes it because it's true, she knows it. She may just not know that she knows. She may not be able to prove that she knows. She can't demonstrate that she knows. But it's enough to know. And whether or not she knows depends on, again, like the explanation of her belief, how we spell the story out. When you ask, like, why does she believe it? You said she was just sort of taught it. Okay, well, why did those teachers teach her that? as a joke, that would be bad. Or like to make business smoother, that would be bad.
It was the closest church to her house, right?
Yeah, closest church to your house, that's bad. But if it's because, well, like her parents taught her because they thought it was true. Why did they think that? Because their parents taught them. Why did their parents teach them? And if we trace this back and eventually it gets back to the truth, then that's okay. And I mean, that's the way most of our scientific beliefs work.
Right.
Most people think the earth is round, but if you ask them to justify it, they'd be at a loss, you know? They have vague memories of learning some things in school, but they can't answer a typical flat earther who's like, you know, well prepared to rebut all of their evidence.
Eddie Bravo.
Yeah, like an Eddie Bravo kind of character. The flat earthers come ready to play, you know, they don't mess around. And so the typical sort of round earther is not in a position to prove or justify their belief that the earth is round. But nevertheless, I think they know. And that's because if you trace back the explanation of their belief, eventually it terminates in somebody who did know. and
because it's true. Yeah, I like that. That does solve a lot of interesting difficulties. Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
I'm a lot more like Grandma Betty probably than you guys are. Right. And I'm perfectly happy to admit.
And that doesn't bother you, right?
That doesn't bother me the least. It really doesn't. I mean, I'm perfect. Like Pat and I have talked about this before. I'm perfectly happy to admit the fact that, I was, raised a Catholic, that I have an Irish surname, right? I mean, all these things probably play a big role in loading the dice for where I'm going to come out epistemic. And I don't think, for reasons that you're saying, Thomas, I don't think that's a defeater necessarily, right? Especially because the views I have about just the way rationality works. I think we have to get the ball off the ground by working within some kind of tradition to begin with, right?
Yeah.
And I think an interesting thing is, however religion has been transmitted, okay, its primary way of being transmitted has not been evidential, right? It's primarily been by one generation taking up a pre-given way of life, right?
Yeah.
And passing it down that way. And I think interesting. I think culturally, this is more of a cultural thing than a philosophical thing. It seems now that we ask an epistemic burden of the individual believer that we may not have been designed to shoulder ourselves, right? Like the vast majority of believing done by humans, right? Whether it be in bigger transcendent things like religion or ethics and stuff like that, all the way down to the perceptual beliefs, has been just taking up the practical ways of being that we were given, right? And going forward with those. It's a fairly new thing under the sun that we ask, but what do you think, right? And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, right? But it does seem like the way of human knowing has been a cooperative thing, right? Something that we do in a tradition, that we do together, that we do in learning, okay? And I'm also, and I'd like to hear your view about any of this, but especially at this point, is I think there's such a thing as epistemic luck, right? And it could be, yeah, if I didn't have an Irish surname and my father's father's father wasn't a Catholic and like came to this country because of that, right? Then I might have different religious belief. That doesn't mean I didn't get lucky, right? And it doesn't mean that this is something I think McIntyre was brilliant on in some of his middle period work, to say, yeah, it might be true that I need a tradition, I need luck to get the ball rolling, right? But I can eventually, within that tradition, ascend to a point where I can see, no, this is the right one. Okay. Yeah. And even if I might admit I can't prove it to someone outside of that tradition, I can get to a point of, understanding that tradition and a point of epistemic responsibility from within it, that I can see, no, it's right. 100% objectively, it's right. Even if, one, I admit it's a contingent fact that I got into it, and two, I might not be able to convince somebody who stands outside of it, right? I think all those are possibilities. And actually, that's just how I think about it, right?
Yeah.
And I think none of them undermine my ability to say it's right.
Yeah. Well, I'm having another new thought thanks to this conversation.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, excellent.
Thanks, fellas. I'm seeing a connection that I hadn't really seen before. Let me try to explain what it is. So I think maybe one of the reasons people these days are attracted to this kind of elsewhere, elsewhen skeptical argument, and they're at all convinced by it, is I think it might be a hangover from a kind of Enlightenment thought. Sometimes I teach a course on like the history of ideas from 1815 to the present.
Yeah.
But I go back to the scientific revolution because I think there's a really interesting epistemic story to be told about how we used to think knowledge could be acquired back in the Middle Ages versus how we now think it can be acquired, if at all. Right. And something interesting that happened was like after the scientific revolution or during the scientific revolution, we sort of, here's the common story. We all learned that Aristotle was wrong and Ptolemy was wrong and heliocentrism is true. And that was really disturbing to people in Western Europe because so much theology and our political setups and our understanding of science relied on all these people that we took to be authorities. And now the story goes, we've learned that these authorities are unreliable. And so that was really upsetting to people living at the time. And I think there was a bit of an overreaction. And the overreaction was we shouldn't believe anything on the basis of tradition anymore. We should test everything for ourselves. We should take nothing on the word of others. That was like the slogan of the Enlightenment, nullius in verba. I think that is still the slogan of the British Royal Society, which is like the oldest scientific body in the world. When Kant asks, what is enlightenment? Think for yourself. Yeah, think for yourself. Exactly. So I think that was an overreaction, but you can kind of understand why they did it. Like it was all very disorienting to watch the like edifice of your belief structure just crumble. That's kind of what motivated Descartes too, to just say, I'm gonna start over. I'm going to pretend none of that stuff happened previously. I'm just going to do this myself. So that was sort of the Enlightenment spirit, the Enlightenment mentality. I think it was a mistake and, as I said, an overreaction. But maybe the reason people are at all moved by this elsewhere, elsewhen argument is because they discount the possibility that, as you said, you like lucked into the right tradition and you're receiving knowledge via transmission of testimony that traces back to the truth because they don't like testimony and they don't think you should believe anything on the basis of testimony. You should believe only things that you have yourself encountered and tested by acquaintance and so on. But the reason that's an overreaction is it's not realistic to try to build an epistemology without testimony. You end up being a radical skeptic, like a David Hume sort of figure. If you discount tradition and testimony entirely and try to just do it yourself, you'll realize that you're not going to get very far. And if you just there are no private languages. Yeah, and if you just take a realistic look at how knowledge seems to be acquired, gosh, I don't want to put a number on it, but it's got to be way north of 90% of our knowledge is received by testimony. Dude, I'd go 99 now. Yeah, it's really hard. Yeah. It's especially scientific knowledge. Like, it's very rare that you actually made the observations yourself or you actually did the experiments yourself. Even scientists rely on the testimony of others via journal articles and books and so on. Yeah. And so once you realize, like, wow, testimony is really important, and what's wrong with it anyway? It's just a kind of indirect way of being connected to the truth. Then when somebody points out to me that, I hold my religious beliefs just because my parents told me, well, so what? How does the story go from there? Does this chain of testimony eventually terminate in the truth? And if so, that's fine. Thanks, Mom and Dad. Yeah, thanks, Mom and Dad. I had one other thing to say, Jim, about you said you believe in epistemic luck. So often when epistemologists use that term, they often have in mind like the bad kind of luck that's incompatible with knowledge. So there does seem to be a kind of luck that is incompatible with knowledge, that precludes knowledge. Gettier cases seem to involve this kind of luck. We can explain what those are if you think we need to, Pat. But there seems to be a bad kind of epistemic luck that precludes knowledge. But I think what you're pointing out, Jim, is it's also possible to know something by luck. There are kinds of luck that are actually compatible with knowledge. And just to use a simple sort of artificial example, it could happen that I witness a car accident or something like that. And maybe the car just misses me, or something, like a car veers off the road, just misses me and crashes into a ditch. So there's a lot that there's a lot of luck in this situation. I'm lucky to be alive. It was sort of an accident that the car crashed. So that was sort of bad luck that the car crashed. But nevertheless, I can know that the car crashed. Here I am observing that it crashed. So those sorts of luck are...
You have maybe a moral knowledge now that you wouldn't have had?
What's that?
You might have a moral knowledge now that you wouldn't have had, right? Like,
oh yeah, so maybe I can make all sorts of inferences that I'm lucky to be in a position to make. Yeah. So there are some kinds of luck that are compatible with knowledge, and sometimes we say, "Wow, I'm really lucky to know that." Or maybe a detective trying to solve a case happens upon the murder weapon, and so is lucky to now know who the perpetrator was, who's guilty. And so it could be that these sorts of elsewhere-else-when arguments are pointing out that if we know that our religious beliefs are true, we would be lucky to know them. And yeah, maybe we should just grant that and say, yes, I would be lucky to know. Many things could have gone wrong. Fortunately, they didn't. And I am connected to truth in the right sort of way for this to count as knowledge.
Right. And I think anybody who wants to tell like an Enlightenment triumphalist story, right, is already committed to something like the position I'm staking here. Because you have to admit you are epistemically lucky. That you believe in quantum indeterminacy and you believe in democracy. Let's face it, all these things, right? So it's not as if I were in the 10th century, I just thought for myself, I would have arrived at the atomic theory.
Right. And who told you to think for yourself anyways? Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but you know what I mean? Like, you have to admit, with respect to the sciences, Enlightenment, politics, all of that stuff, we're epistemically lucky.
Right.
Right. Because there's no amount of free thinking that would have got you to Einstein in the 5th century.
Right. Yeah. Hey, so Thomas, I know we've taken up a ton of your time, so if you need to just bounce, just click exit. We totally understand. Otherwise,
I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes. Yeah.
Do you want to take like one or two questions from the audience?
Today, Thomas? Are you rolling today?
No, I trained yesterday. I have some mats in my garage, and we have a little garage dojo going in the age of COVID. But it looks like, I mean, the gym that I was training at closed during COVID, unfortunately. Sure. But one of my buddies is going to open his own gym, so I might end up training there.
Do you have children, Thomas?
I have one daughter. She's 10 years old.
Does she train?
She did for 6 months when she was like 7 or 8 years old, but she doesn't really have much aggression in her.
Fair enough.
And so it just wasn't for her. I think like she was what's the word, humoring me and like going along with it. Sure, I was into it and she wanted to try it, but then she got like a heel in the mouth one time and that was it.
Yeah, fair enough.
She's like, I don't think I want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we take a question or two from the audience before we wrap up here?
Sure. Yeah, let's do that.
So let's do a few. Analytic Christian says, tell Dr. Bogardus I said hello. Shout out to the Analytic Christian here. Yeah. Brendan just says, this is great stuff. Well, thanks. I've been having a blast. This has been a really fun conversation. All right, let's get a question now. Here's one from Alex. He says, what are some good resources on epistemology in defense for metaphysics? This question is aimed for discussions with analytic philosophers and professors. You guys have any recommendations or resources here for the gentle listener?
Good resources on epistemology in defense of metaphysics. So I guess maybe what this questioner has in mind is they're encountering some reasons to think that like we're not good at metaphysics, and especially intuition-driven sort of philosophy is unreliable. So I guess I would, if that is what's motivating this question, there is some stuff I would recommend, I guess. So I would say you should read some George Beeler. I mean, I could Google some titles. They're sort of escaping me right now. But George Beeler, Timothy Williamson, who else would be good to read in defense of the reliability of intuitions? Hey, let me plug a friend of mine, John Bankson. We went to grad school together. He wrote a nice paper in response to sort of experimental philosophy attacks on the reliability of intuitions. So experimental philosophers went around conducting surveys. And,
that was the thing for a while, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was pretty trendy for a while. And the conclusions they were drawing were like, there's all this variation in philosophical intuition, so why trust yours? It was kind of similar to this elsewhere, else when kind of debunking argument. Like, look at all this variation. Why think you got it right? So there's another instance where this kind of debunking argument shows up. But the name of this paper I'm thinking of is, I think it's Experimental Attacks on Intuitions and Answers. That's the name of the title, or that's the title. Experimental Attacks on Intuitions and Answers. So I thought that was a really nice rebuttal of this kind of line of attack on the reliability of intuition. Another philosopher you might read is Joel Pust. I think that's how you say his last name, P-U-S-T, Joel Pust. Gives a nice defense of intuition, the use of intuition in philosophy. But yeah, George Beeler, Timothy Williamson, John Bankson, Joel Pust. These are names that come to mind.
Good starting reading list there. Jim, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No.
Cool. Awesome. Okay, I think we've kept Dr. Bogardus here for long enough. You've been super gracious with your time, and I've just delighted in this conversation. So before we go, where can people keep up with your work? Do you have anything that you're working on that you want to mention? Do you have any social media accounts people should follow? Just give us all the good details there. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter. Occasionally I post there. It's mostly about gender stuff, though. I guess that's sort of the brand that I've developed on Twitter, just talking about gender stuff, philosophy of gender. But if you want to read my papers, if you just Google my name, typically the first result is my personal website where I link to all my papers. So that's what I would do. Google my name or look for me on Twitter. That's probably the best way.
Beautiful. Excellent. Well, I'll link that in the show notes. And Dr. Bogardus, it has been a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time.
All right. Thank you.